Friday about pedigrees, and pedigrees aren't just for looking at a family and saying like, oh, that person is older than that person and that's that person's grandma. What we really use pedigrees for is to show genetic disorders that travel through generations. So people like genetics counselors use pedigrees to tell people their chances of passing on a genetic disorder, or of being a carrier for a genetic disorder. So to do this, we use more diagramming. So what we do is we fill in a square or a circle to denote a person, an affected person, or a person who has a disorder. So if somebody in the pedigree in the family has a genetic disorder, we fill in their square or their circle. Okay. And then we also can half shade in a square or a circle to show if somebody is carrying a harmful allele, but they don't have the disorder. So we represent a carrier by coloring in their shape halfway. So you could read this, but this is what we learned about on Friday about pedigrees and how they're set up. So I'm going to skip past that. All right, so today we're going to learn about 3 different inheritance patterns and how you see them in a pedigree. So we're going to start with one that is autosomal recessive. So we talked about this yesterday. I have notes on what it means to be autosomal recessive. So we're going to look at albinism again, being an albino. And just as a reminder, this disorder causes a lack of pigment in the skin, hair, and eyes. And it can also occur in animals. But the thing I want you to know about it is that if these are the genotypes of individuals, then what would their phenotypes be? So they're either normal or albino. Because this is autosomal recessive, to be albino, you have to have 2 recessive alleles. So little a is albino. Big A would be normal, so normal pigment. And then the heterozygous person is normal, meaning they're not albino, but they are what we would call a carrier, because they're carrying that recessive allele that can cause a person to be albino, but they're not an albino themselves. All right, so let's take a look at our first pedigree showing autosomal recessive. So this is a family that it's a mom and dad who had 5 kids, and their middle child, their son, was born albino. So we know if he is albino, we know he's little a. Now, parents are not albino. But what do the parents' genotypes have to be if they have a child that is albino? So if you have a child that has that's albino, but you don't have it, we know you have a big A. These parents both have a big A, but they both gave a little a to their child. So they both have to be heterozygous. So we can fill out a Punnett square and I could show you how this works, but hopefully by now you understand. When you cross 2 people that are heterozygous, they have a 25% chance of having a child who's homozygous recessive. So in this case, both parents would be carriers, and then the child would have this disorder. This right here is a telltale sign of a autosomal recessive pedigree. So you are going to have to be able to figure out what type of pedigree you're looking at. So this is going to be clue number 1. So clue number 1 is when you have 2 normal parents, meaning they don't have the disorder, with a child who has the disorder. So that is how we know that this is autosomal recessive. Okay, 2 normal parents have a child with the disorder. So we could fill in these 2 parents halfway to denote that they're carriers. You don't always see pedigrees filled in halfway, but you could fill these 2 in for sure. All right. By the way, this is a little bit more tricky. Do we know the genotypes of the other siblings of the albino child? For sure, like 100% we could say exactly what it is. Because it could be big A, right? Or it could be big A, little a. We don't know for sure. Okay, we know that they have a big A because they're not albino, but we can't be sure that they're not carrying. If we did the Punnett square, you would see that these siblings all have a 50% chance of being a carrier and a 25% chance of not being a carrier. All right, so let's do another one. Same disorder. So we're still looking at albinism. So again, fill in the genotypes of the parents that you know for sure. So using an A for albinism, anyone who's filled in, you know their genotypes. So we know, that this girl is albino, and we know that her dad was albino. Now, do we know what this mother's genotype would be? How do we know?
Because it can't be homozygous dominant, because then they wouldn't be able to have a child that is albino.
Awesome. All right. So we know they can't be homozygous dominant because they have a child who's albino. So we know they're big A to start. And because they have a child that's albino, they have to be heterozygous. Good. How about the other 2 sisters? Do we know their genotype for sure? What do they have to be because of dad? They also have to be heterozygous, right? Because dad can only give a little a. That's all he has to give. And we know they don't have it, so they receive their big A from their mom. All right, so the next 2 questions down here, every one of you should be able to answer these already. These are things we talked about last Friday. You had a homework assignment about it. We did a warm-up yesterday. So those questions should be simple for everybody. If they aren't, I'm going to suggest you go back and watch videos from Friday, take a look at notes, but they do have 3 children and all of them are female. Right? All right, let's do one more autosomal recessive pedigree. Again, we're going to use A for albinism. So again, fill in all of the genotypes that you know for sure. All right, so again, first of all, there's a telltale sign right here that this is autosomal recessive, even though I told you that it was, because you have two parents that are unaffected that have a child that have it. So that is your clue. But I also told you that this was autosomal recessive. And then for the ones that are not filled in, we know they have a dominant A. It's the question of, can we figure out the second letter that they would have? So looking at grandma here or grandpa here, what would his other letter be? If you look at their kids, you can tell. Yeah, he has to be big A, little a, because he has a daughter who's an albino. All right, how about these two sons? They also have to have a little a because of mom, right? And then finally, this female right here, because she has a son with albinism, also has to be big A, little a, right? So sometimes, well, first of all, albinism is not that common. It's very rare. So this pedigree that shows it happening in every generation is a little bit unlikely, because there aren't that many carriers. There's not that many people that have it. So this one's a little bit unique. But again, you should be able to answer these 3 questions about the pedigrees without much trouble. So how many children does the original couple have? They have 3, right? This female right here marries into the family. She's not blood related to the family. How many grandchildren does the original couple have? Anyone? So this is the original couple. How many grandkids do they have? They have 1. And it is a square, so that is what? That's a male. All right, so like I had mentioned, you are going to need to determine between autosomal recessive, autosomal dominant, and X-linked recessive. So I want to go through an example of each of these. I just went through autosomal recessive with you for 3 pedigrees, so I'm going to kind of do this one a little bit quicker. So the biggest thing is if there are 2 unaffected parents that have a child with the disorder, then you're looking at autosomal recessive. Okay, so what I mean by that is 2 parents that are normal that have a child that has it. 2 parents that are normal that have a child that has it. Okay, that is a clue that it's autosomal recessive. Once you figure out that it's autosomal recessive, then I want you to be able to go in and tell me the genotypes of the people in the pedigree. So another example of an autosomal recessive trait is cystic fibrosis. And this is I'm calling it a terrible autosomal recessive disorder because it causes the person to have severe mucus built up in their airways. And I don't mean like if you've been really sick and you had phlegm in your throat and you coughed up a loogie and you're like, oh, that was awful. This is every day these people have the chance of not being able to breathe because of the mucus that is forming in their lungs. So they have to have things like they have to wear, sometimes they wear vests that like help vibrate their body so it can loosen up that mucus. I actually went to high school with a girl who had cystic fibrosis, and her brother had to like pound on her back every couple hours to loosen up the phlegm, the mucus in her lungs so she could breathe. Like she had to take breaks in the day, and like her brother had to pound on her back. And I was always just like, oh my God, that looks so painful. But it was so that she could breathe. So this is a very, very serious genetic disorder that can be fatal. And again, it's autosomal recessive. So if we're going to use the letter F to represent this, so little f is how we are going to show cystic fibrosis. So if we look at this pedigree here, we have this girl right here that has cystic fibrosis. What's the other genotypes that we know for sure? Her parents, right? And what do we know their parents have to be? So they both have a big F. They don't have cystic fibrosis, but because they have that daughter that has it, they have to be heterozygous. Now, do we know the genotype of the siblings for sure? We do not, because they have a big F. That is true. But we cannot say without a doubt that they're big F or big F little f. Until one of them has a child and their child has cystic fibrosis, we may never know if they're a carrier. But this might be a situation where like this sister might be like, wow, I watched my sister really struggle with cystic fibrosis and I have a 50% chance of being a carrier. She might decide not to have children based on that. Obviously, her mate would have to be a carrier as well. So looking at whether cystic fibrosis is in the family, but that's one of the reasons we use pedigrees is to determine the chance of being a carrier. All right, so we have one more autosomal recessive. I know I've been kind of beating this version a little bit harder than I'm going to do the other ones. But again, you could tell who has it. We have our telltale sign right here of the two parents that don't have it, that have a child with it. And from there, we can determine the genotypes of most everyone in this pedigree. So we know that these two parents have to be carriers, right? Because they have a child with it. What about persons 2-1 and 2-2? And why? So I have a student who's saying they are heterozygous. You are correct, but why?
Because they don't have it and their father does.
Yeah, so they don't have it. So they have the dominant allele, but dad had to give them a little allele. Mom over here, we know she's big F, but we don't know what her other letter is. You might want to say, well, she must be big F, because none of her kids have cystic fibrosis, but that's not for sure. Just because she has 3 kids and none of them had cystic fibrosis doesn't mean she's homozygous dominant. And then the last person down here, this is another big F question mark because we don't know for sure. It's the same thing as these two parents. And if we did a Punnett square, you would see that there's a 50% chance of them being carriers. There's a 25% chance of them being homozygous dominant have it had a 25% chance with those parents. All right, so another telltale sign of autosomal dominant is that it often skips a generation. You'll see that autosomal recessive can skip a generation. Whereas the next type we're gonna do doesn't skip generations. All right, so let's then take a look at autosomal dominant. So here we have an autosomal dominant pedigree. And the first big thing is that it doesn't skip a generation. Every generation has it. That's the first clue. And the second clue is there's no children who have the disorder without at least one parent having the disorder. So in order for it to be autosomal dominant, one parent has to have it in order to give it to their kids. Okay, so let's see what that looks like by writing in some genotypes. So the example that I'm going to give you today is one that actually hits close to home because I actually have this mutation. So BRCA2 is a gene that everybody has, but some people have a mutation in that gene, and it can lead to breast cancer, like higher chances of breast cancer for females. And so you only need to have one dominant allele to have this BRCA2 mutation. So you only need one. So if we use the letter B for BRCA2, remember that autosomal dominant has no carriers. You either have the mutation or you don't have it. So there's no carriers. So I know this is weird, but now we have to switch around our brains and write in the genotypes of the people who are not filled in. Because people who are not filled in are now homozygous recessive. Okay, so everybody that doesn't have a circle or a square filled in is little b, little b. So the people that are filled in, we would say they have one big B. And then we can look at the family members to figure out what their other allele is. So I'm just going to write my big B's on each of these people that have it. All right, so now if we look at the first person in generation 1 here, 1, 2, the first mom, she has a daughter here, her firstborn child, that is little b, who doesn't have the BRCA2 gene. So what does she have to be? What does her genotype have to be if she has a little b child?
We're all heterozygous.
So Ryan, you are correct, but I want to make sure that everybody knows how. So because this mom has a little b daughter, she has to be heterozygous. This son right here has a dad who's little b. So he has to be big B, little b. And the same thing goes with his sister over here. So because they have a father who's little b, he can only pass on the little b to his children. If we look at the third generation down here, we have these three, 2 siblings and a cousin here. And the same thing goes for them. They both have a parent that's little b. So that means that they're all heterozygous. All right. So I want to quickly share with you my own personal pedigree that shows BRCA2 in my family. And I also want to point out that BRCA2 is not something you can see. So it's not like albinism or cystic fibrosis. It's not something that you can see. Somebody needs to be genetically tested for it. So last year I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And so I was genetically tested and found out that I had the BRCA2 mutation. And then my siblings were all tested as well. And my oldest sister also has the BRCA2 mutation. None of my other siblings tested positive. Everybody got tested in my family just because of they had a 50% chance of having it because I had it. And then my dad has passed away, so he never even knew that I had cancer. But my mom recently got tested, and my mom tested negative, which means it was my dad who gave it to me and my sister. Now, both his parents, my grandparents, are deceased as well. So we don't know exactly which parent gave it to my dad, but I have a sinking suspicion that it was my grandma because she had 2 nieces that turned out to have breast cancer at the age of 40 as well. So I think it came from my grandma's side on my dad's mom. This aunt right here, my dad's sister, she was tested and she doesn't have it. So she's little b. This uncle right here has not been tested. So we don't know if he has it. We can't even say if he's little b, because until you get a genetics test, you can't tell if you have it or not. So I'm trying to get this is my Uncle Tom. I'm trying to get him to get tested because he's got 3 kids who all he has a bunch of grandkids. So before they all get tested, if he got tested first, that would be the best. But we'll see what happens with that. But I want to point out who I'm most concerned about right now. I mean, I'm worried about my uncle and his family, but I'm most concerned about my sister's kids. So my older sister has 2 kids. Her firstborn was a son named Jackson, and her secondborn is my now niece Ren, who was born Jonas. So this symbol that I've drawn here is a transgender female. So this is the symbol for a transgender female. And how you write it is he was born a male, so the square is in the middle, but he identifies now as a female. So that's how you denote transgender female. And the reason why you want to make sure to still include the gender that she was assigned at birth is because with BRCA2, that means different types of cancer are common. So for females, it's like an 80% chance of getting breast cancer. For males, it's a higher percent of chance getting prostate cancer, pancreas cancer. So there's other things that you need to worry about. So these 2 need to get tested yet, not just for themselves, but also for their future children. Because if they have the BRCA mutation, like they both might have it, then they could end up passing it on to any children that they have. So these are the 2 that are, for me, they're the ones I'm most concerned about right now. Again, notice how it doesn't skip generations. So I had to have a grandma, I'm pretty sure it was grandma, my dad, and then me and my sister. So when it's autosomal dominant, it doesn't skip generations, or it's very rare that it skips generations. All right, so we have one last type of pedigree to look at, and that is X-linked recessive. And I'm sorry that I left this one for last because I think this is the hardest one personally, only because Now you have to write in the X's and the Y's for everybody. So I just want to remind you, this is X-linked recessive. So in order for a male to have it, they have to have the recessive allele on their X. They don't have anything on their Y, right? So males have one X and one Y, and the Y doesn't get a superscript. Females, because they have two X's, they can be homozygous dominant and be unaffected. They can be heterozygous and they don't have the disorder, but they carry it. Or for a female to have it, she has to have two recessive alleles. Okay, so a couple of your clues that you're looking at an X-linked recessive pedigree. First of all, more males are going to have it than females. That's the first clue. So you're going to see a lot more squares that are filled in than circles. Okay, that's your first clue. Your second clue is any female that has it, all of her sons are going to have it. Because remember, for a female to have it, she has to be homozygous recessive. So all of her sons have to have the disorder. So if you have a female who has it and you're like, I'm trying to figure out if this is X-linked or if it's autosomal dominant, look at your females. If they have kids that are normal, then it can't be X-linked recessive. Okay, so let's fill in everybody that we know. And by the way, that you can fill in quite a few that you know here, because any male that's filled in, we already know his genotype, and any male that's not filled in, we already know his phenotype. So any male that's not filled in has to be the dominant H. So we have quite a couple of those guys that we know for sure, right? And then any male that is filled in, we know they have the recessive allele. And then any females that are filled in, we know their genotype already. And now we have 4 females that we have to figure out what their genotypes are. So because they're not filled in, we know they have at least a big H. We're wondering what their other letter is. So I'm just going to write those in. I'm going to write all of my females with their H, and then I'm going to just leave their other X blank. All right, so for this female right here, person 22, what does their other X have to be based on their dad? Dad can only give little h to his daughters, right? So this daughter has to be a carrier, right? And then she has a sister who's going to have the same situation, right? So this sister got the big H from dad. He can only give a big H, but mom, being homozygous recessive for hemophilia, has to give it to her daughter. Going down to these 3 individuals, oops, I forgot one female here. Do we know these 2 girls' second X for sure? So dad had to give him the big H, right? Because that's what he gave his daughters. But do we know what their second X is going to be for sure? We do not. So these 2 are question marks because they could be homozygous dominant or they could be carriers. Until they had a child that ended up having hemophilia, they wouldn't know if they were a carrier or not. All right, I have done a lot of talking. With the rest of class, I want you to get started on your homework. So your homework is the next 3 pages. It starts off with me giving you the clues for how you tell the difference. So the first 2 boxes are how you tell if they're autosomal recessive or dominant. And then the third one is how to tell if it's X-linked. And so X-linked has quite a few more clues that you have to look at. One of the big ones, if you look at pedigree number 3, I have on here, it says, note, pay attention to the mothers with unaffected sons. So you might want to say this is X-linked in your brain because you're like, oh, there's a bunch of X's, and Miss Klepper said if there's a lot of squares filled in, that's X-linked. But can a mom who has an X-linked trait like these moms, can they have normal sons? I would like you to try to fill in all the ones that you can. So like, for instance, the first one here, there's actually only 4 people you can fill in for sure. So you're gonna first determine the type of inheritance and why you think that. So give me your reasoning, and then fill in the genotypes that you can. You can use whatever letters you want, but fill in as many as you can. And that is your homework assignment.